Hi everyone, my name is Olivia Penna and I will be discussing a biopsychosocial evaluation of the prevalence of eating disorders among adolescent female athletes participating in aesthetic sports. First, I want to define some key terms. Aesthetic sports are sports that require power, speed, endurance, and flexibility, as well as technical artistry. Examples include dance, gymnastics, cheerleading, and synchronized swimming and diving. Disordered eating is evaluated on a continuum. At one end, there's optimized nutrition, which includes healthy eating and training behaviors, disordered eating, which includes long-term restrictive dieting, fasting, purging, and overtraining. And on the far end is clinical eating disorder diagnoses such as anorexia nervosa, bulimia, or an eating disorder not otherwise specified. And for the purpose of this discussion, most of the athletes will either exhibit disordered eating behaviors or an eating disorder not otherwise specified. So throughout my research, I discovered that disordered eating was especially common among young females participating in aesthetic sports compared to non-athletes and even athletes in other sport types. So my goal for this presentation was to examine the relationship that exists between aesthetic sport participation and eating disorders among adolescent females, specifically using a biopsychosocial framework. So I will be discussing the biological, psychological, and sociocultural risk factors that are specific to this demographic and make them especially vulnerable to eating disorders. Understanding these risk factors can allow for the most effective methods of prevention and treatment to be developed. First, we'll look at the biological risk factors. So eating disorders show a strong gender bias towards females. The prevalence of eating disorders is only between 0 and 19% for male athletes, but it is between 6 and 45% in female athletes. And this is further amplified by the social and societal pressures that females experience. Then there's adolescence, which is an especially vulnerable time for females to develop eating disorders. Specifically, when they participate in aesthetic sports, their developmental changes conflict with the desired lean image of the sport. And then there's genetic influences. So twin studies indicate genetic influences on eating disorders, and a recent study showed that increased estrogen during adolescence may further enhance any genetic influence present on the development of eating disorders. Next, we'll look at the psychological risk factors, the primary one being body image dissatisfaction. Athletes from leanness-focused sports have reported higher levels of body image dissatisfaction than those in non-lean-focused sports. Furthermore, there's the stress caused by the intense training regimens and competitive environment of aesthetic sports, which can lead to anxiety, low self-esteem, which further increases that body image dissatisfaction and the risk for eating disorders as a whole. Lastly, there's perfectionism, which is extremely common in aesthetic environments and even in some family environments, and maladaptive perfectionism can have implications that lead to eating disorders, especially among athletes. Lastly, we'll look at the sociocultural risk factors. First, there's a large emphasis on leanness in aesthetic sports. Athletes show a high desire to achieve the lowest possible body fat percentages and lowest possible body weight to optimize their performance. They may participate in restrictive dieting and or overtraining to achieve this extremely lean figure. And a systematic review found that there was a significant increase in disordered eating among sports that emphasize leanness as a competing factor. There's also social pressures present in aesthetic sports from coaches and peers. Over 60% of elite athletes from leanness-focused sports reported pressure from their coaches concerning their body shape. And lastly, athletes may exhibit disordered eating behaviors to try to optimize their performance. Because the performances are judged on aesthetics, comments from the judges may lead to concerns about body shape that may further encourage disordered eating behaviors. So this model summarizes and demonstrates how all of those risk factors interact to influence one's risk of eating disorders. And as you can see, body image dissatisfaction is the primary risk factor. that results from participation in aesthetic sports. To conclude, a biopsychosocial approach needs to be used to address the prevalence of disordered eating among adolescent female athletes in aesthetic sports. Doing so will allow us to create the most effective methods of prevention, which can include the education of athletes and coaches about eating disorders, changes to regulations to discourage unhealthy eating habits, new tools for the screening and assessment of eating disorders among these athletes, and overall a cultural shift that promotes healthy eating and positive body image in aesthetic sports. Here are the references used in this presentation, and thank you for watching.